Today we will be installing a front suspension kit for a 2008 Chrysler 300C. This kit includes the following items: lower control arms, front tension struts, upper control arms, and inner tie rods. Now before installing the inner tie rods, take the locking washer with the raised sides facing out and install them on the rack end of the inner tie rod. Also included is front sway bars, outer tie rod ends. The tie rod ends come with a locking nut and a greaser that you should install right away. Also includes lower ball joint set with circlip, locking nut, and a greaser that should also be installed before installation of the ball joint. The tools involved for the job will be a ball joint separator, a ball joint press, slip joint pliers, a pipe wrench, pliers, a flathead screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver and a small Phillips screwdriver, a 7mm wrench, an 8mm wrench, a 21mm wrench, a 22mm wrench, and a 24mm wrench, along with an electric impact, a long 1/2-inch extension, a 3/8 torque wrench, a 1/2-inch torque wrench, a large pry bar, a long breaker bar, a big hammer, long 3/8 extension, an electric ratchet, 3/8-inch ratchet, 1/4-inch ratchet, a small pry bar, 12mm Allen key, external snap ring pliers, long 10mm socket, small 10mm socket, medium 10mm socket, large 13mm socket, large 8mm socket, large universal joint, large 15mm socket, short 1/2-inch extension, short 22mm socket, 1/2-inch to 3/8 adapter, 3/8 to 1/4-inch adapter with 8mm socket, 15mm socket, long 21mm socket, long 22mm socket, long 19mm socket, and long 18mm socket. With a 22mm socket, extension, and breaker bar, loosen the lug nuts before lifting the vehicle in the air. Once supported in the air, remove the lug nuts and then fully remove the wheel. Use an 18mm socket to remove the upper control arm nuts. Once removed, strike around the ball joint until it pops free. Now we can lower the vehicle so you can open the hood to gain access to the power steering reservoir. We can now remove it with a small pry bar. Use a 7mm socket on the intake pipe clamp to loosen the clamp. And now use a small pry bar to pry away the exhaust gas pipe and then remove the upper filter cover. Disconnect the intake air temperature sensor connector and remove the upper intake cover. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolts for the coolant reservoir and move it aside, so you can use an 18mm socket to remove the front upper control arm bolts. Now remove the cowl panel cover and use an 18mm socket and ratchet and remove the rear upper control arm bolt and nuts. Use a 13mm socket to remove the top shock absorber bolts, and use a 22mm socket to remove the sway bar end link nuts. Use an 18mm socket to remove the lower shock absorber bolt, and now remove the shock absorber. And take out the upper control arm bolts so you can remove the upper control arm entirely. Install the new control arm, bolts, and nuts, and then use an 18mm socket to tighten the upper suspension bolts. Then torque those nut and bolts to 75 Newton meters. Install the shock absorber and then let it hang by the top hat nuts. Install the steering knuckle and secure the upper suspension ball joint nut. Install the lower shock absorber bolt and use an 18mm socket to tighten the lower shock absorber bolt. Use a 19mm socket to secure the upper control arm ball joint nut and then install the sway bar end link, lower nut, and use a 21mm socket to tighten the nut. Now torque the upper control arm ball joint nut to 47 Newton meters plus 90 degrees of rotation. Now torque the lower shock absorber bolt to 147 Newton meters. And then torque the sway bar end link nut to 128 Newton meters. Now remove the sway bar end link nut with a 21 millimeter socket, and then remove the sway bar end link. Use a pry bar to remove the fender liner clips, and then use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the fender liner screws. Use an 18 millimeter socket with a 21 millimeter wrench to remove the lower control arm bolt. Use a 21 millimeter socket to remove the front control arm lower ball joint nut, and then use a ball joint separator to remove the front control arm ball joint. Once you've done that, remove the control arm entirely, and then use a 21 millimeter socket to remove the outer tie rod nut. Then use a 24 millimeter wrench to loosen the outer tie rod adjustment nut, and then remove the outer tie rod completely. Then use a pair of pliers to remove the steering rack boot clip, and then use a flathead screwdriver to remove the boot clamp. Now remove the dust boot and use a pipe wrench to loosen the inner tie rod, and then remove the inner tie rod. Now we are going to remove the sway bar and brackets, so to do that you'll need an 8 millimeter socket and remove the bolts holding on the heat shield. Now you can use a 15 millimeter socket to remove the sway bar bracket bolts, and then remove the brackets so you can safely remove the sway bar entirely. Use a 21 millimeter socket with a 12 millimeter hex key to remove the tension arm mounting bolt. Use a 21 millimeter wrench to remove the steering knuckle ball joint nut. Then tap lightly with a hammer to help loosen. Use an 18 millimeter socket to remove the lower shock absorber bolt, and then remove the lower control arm. Use snap ring pliers to remove the ball joint snap ring, and then use a hammer to knock out the ball joint. Install the new ball joint, and then remove the boot before installation to prevent damage to the boot. And then now press in the ball joint, and then reinstall the snap ring, and then reinstall the boot. Now install the ball joint by using a 22 millimeter socket with a long extension bar to tighten, and then install the grease fitting using an 8 millimeter wrench. Install the control arm with the bolts, washers, and nuts, and then install the tension arm ball joint into the knuckle with the nut. Use a 22 millimeter socket to tighten the ball joint nut, and then use an 18 millimeter socket with a 21 millimeter wrench to finish tightening the control arm bolts. Install the inner tie rod, and then tighten with a pipe wrench. Install the dust boot and snap ring, pinching the end to re-secure the boot. Then reinstall the outer clip, and then install the adjustment nut. Now we can insert the grease fitting into the outer tie rod end, and then tighten it with an 8 millimeter wrench. Now install the outer tie rod onto the inner tie rod and tighten the tie rod ball joint nut using a 22 millimeter long socket to secure the ball joint. And then use a 22 millimeter wrench to tighten the tie rod jam nut. Using a 21 millimeter socket and 12 millimeter hex, torque the lower control arms to 176 Newton meters. Then with an 18 millimeter socket, torque the lower shock bolt to 174 Newton meters. Then with a 22 millimeter socket, torque both ball joint nuts to 68 Newton meters plus 90 degrees of rotation. Then with a 22 millimeter, repeat that step again on the lower ball joint. Then, using an 18 millimeter socket and a 21 millimeter wrench, torque the control arm nut to 176 Newton meters. Install the sway bar brackets, the sway bar, and then the sway bar bolts. With a 15 millimeter socket, tighten the sway bar bushing bolts, and then torque them to 60 Newton meters. Install the sway bar heat shield and then bolts, and torque them with an 8 millimeter socket to 7 Newton meters. Reinstall the fender liner screws and clips, and install the sway bar end link and nuts, And with a 19mm socket, tighten the sway bar nuts and then torque it to 128 Newton meters. Lower the vehicle and then use an 18mm socket and torque the upper control arm nut to 75 Newton meters. Then use a 13mm socket to tighten the upper strut bolts and then proceed to torque it to 27 Newton meters. Reinstall the coolant reservoir and power steering reservoir and then reinstall all the 10mm bolts and then tighten them down. Install the cowl cover, intake air temperature sensor, throttle duct, and air filter upper cover. Reconnect the engine exhaust gas pipe and tighten the intake throttle clamp. And now you can close the hood. Now we can reinstall the wheels and thread on the lug nuts. You can use a 21mm socket and tighten the lug nuts evenly so that way you can torque them to 200 Newton meters in a star pattern.